Camryn, thank you for taking the time today. How are you doing this afternoon?
Hi, Bruce. I'm doing well. Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Again, thank you for being willing to, just talk a little bit about your experience. And I think especially, as one of the like founding members of the BSU at Lake Oswego High School, I think is very important for current students, Black students in particular, but students of color in general, to kind of, get an opportunity to kind of like engage with that. Sounds weird saying that history, but it was true. So I guess just from a starting point, though, can you just talk about like what years you went through Lake Oswego School District, and what brought your family to LO?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Vegas. My parents moved out to Lake Oswego when I was about 9. Um, Job opportunities. My parents really like the weather up here. Just big change from desert of Vegas, obviously. So I moved out here and I was about 9, and I went to high school from 2014 to 2017, or 13 to 17, whatever the time is on that one. Yeah. So it definitely was a big culture shock compared to the community that I grew up in. Uh, Las Vegas, I grew up in the suburbs there as well, but it was a lot more diverse and very multicultural. Similar economic status as Lake Oswego, but my neighbors were Latino and Native American and Asian. I had just a plethora of different types of culture around me growing up versus here. So I think that was a really instant difference that I noticed as a kid was how white a lot of my surroundings were and how different I was in comparison to those surroundings.
Yeah, and sort of touching on that, like, so what would you say like you as well as your family did as far as finding community once you got out here?
Yeah, I would say I think that was a very nuanced piece for my family. So growing up in a multicultural family, like my father's black, my mom's white, very isolating. We didn't have a lot of multicultural families in the community. I think there was like one other family when we were in elementary school that we knew of. The parents were mixed race and kids were mixed too. But there was really not a lot of representation, not a lot of community. I think um, as a kid, I didn't notice it as much until now, and kind of thinking retrospectively how hard it must have been for my dad to not have fellow like black dads to kind of have that similar relationship or experience with, and just the isolation of that, and how to process and deal with that isolation alone, because there's not other people necessarily to validate like, yeah, it is really different than growing up in a community or being in a community where you've got other black families or other families that look like yours. So I think we focused a lot on like other community activities. Like I played sports growing up, traveling sports all my life, but I never really played for LO. I played a couple of years like for softball, but even then I played for the Lake Ridge side. And I know that there's a connotation between Lake Oswego and Lake Ridge that there's always more diversity on the Lake Ridge side. It's oddly true. And so I remember that experience growing up playing softball and just only finding diversity when I would not be in predominantly LO spaces. So I think my family spent a lot of time trying to explore and travel in the Portland metro area just to figure out like what the other communities looked like. I think my earliest experience or memory of like seeing other black people or like feeling at home, or it's just like when my dad would go get his haircut at Geneva's up in North Portland, and being at the barbershop with my dad was like, oh yeah, like it's finally like a space and an environment where it's all us, and that's not focus, that's not a point of conversation, like it doesn't matter that we're all black. So I think finding those pockets of safety growing up in Portland was nuanced. You had to find them. It wasn't like just readily available, especially here in Lake Oswego.
It's funny you say that. I had a very similar experience as far as like most of my like activity in LO was like going to school, playing basketball in my case. And even then, when I think about some of my like fondest basketball memories, it's not like with the LO team. And I say this as someone who's like, granted on the bench, but like we did win a state championship. And like I don't think about that as like, ooh, that those were the good times. Like most of those good times were like spring or fall ball with a coach who also happened to do a bunch of stuff with like Lake Ridge, have the practices at Lake Ridge, you know, play games with like the hoop and stuff. So it's interesting how that works out. Um, yeah, can you just talk a little bit more though about the experience at Lake Oswego High School specifically?
Yeah. So um, high school was interesting. Um, there was a lot of different factors. I think going into high school, just like any other high schooler, you want to fit in, you want to figure out what your interests are. Like I said earlier, coming through like a very sport oriented background, I came into high school playing sports, like kind of in the basketball scene, definitely playing on the softball team and things like that. But and that was my only like comfort space, I would say, was like hanging out with athletes and being around like other athletes. And I think as time went on, I started to realize that I am a lot more interested in my academics. Like sports are interesting, but I really like learning in school, and I really like um, just being challenged in classes and wanting to focus more on that. And I started to find um, different outlets to express and kind of explore. Like journalism class was one of those first peak classes that made me realize I really enjoy writing. I really like public speaking. I really enjoy being able to like talk and communicate and share my story and learn other people's stories as well. I think the social aspect of high school was really challenging for me in ways that I didn't and I wasn't able to comprehend when I was in high school. I think I spent a lot of time in high school trying to convince myself things weren't the way that they were. I think there's a lot of pressure growing up being one of four Black girls in your class and being all uniquely different, but the need to have a monolith or like put us all into one group and try to that was really confusing for me. I think struggling with an identity piece and like what I was supposed to be in comparison to my white peers or their projection or perception of me. I think high school is high school and people are bold and people are in a time of exploration and um, trying to navigate racial tension and just conversations and themes of race with my peers was really, really, really challenging for me. I was comfortable doing it. I think more out of like force and recognized necessity that if I'm not going to be the person to say something, nobody's going to say anything, and that's just I'm not that kind of person. It doesn't sit well with my psyche. So I started to experience a lot of like resistance and like social tension with like my peers probably around my junior year, sophomore, junior year, um, because I was a little bit less go along, get along. Like if my white friends would say the N word, it wasn't something that I could just ignore. Um, and I think that became maybe tiresome isn't the right word, but constantly being told by one of your friends, like, watch, like, mind your mouth or don't say these things. Like, I'm sure it felt annoying after a while. Um, it definitely made it a lot more challenging to feel safe and like wanting to engage with other peers. Like, and I'm really thinking about these things as a very retrospective state. I think when I was in high school, I would just was like in fight or flight, trying to defend myself and make it cool and still make myself approachable so that I could still be friendly and have friends and be social. Um, but it was a lot of like shifting and shading and navigating and defending and reflecting and blocking and doing it in a way that did not make me unapproachable. I think I was very fixated on making sure people still liked me. I mean, I was a high schooler. I just wanted to be liked, you know? So, yeah, that was high school was nuanced and that's probably long winded, but
No, no, no. That I, again, it's just something that I want to talk about writing and story of like behind the BSU, but I want to stay on that point about, you know, that feeling, that urge to, kind of like minimize what's happening to you when you're in the moment. Because, that was growing up in the 90s for me. I know like teachers all the time, like really just hammered in this point. Like everyone's equal. It's a colorblind society. The civil rights movement happened. Everything's fine. Yay. That's what they'd say. Then they'd also do things that are just, you know, overtly racist, or at least at the very basis, like, targeting, detrimental, just
Asking
like
you to read. I think I remember sophomore year or something like that. My sophomore English teacher asked if I would be the one to read To Kill a Mockingbird out loud in class. I'm the only Black kid in the class. Like, nah, I don't really feel like reading it out loud. Thanks, though. Little things like that, I totally remember. And like, not wanting to be defensive and not wanting to be disrespectful because you respect your elder always. And but how do you navigate that as a 15-year-old kid, knowing that it doesn't feel right? I don't know how it doesn't feel right, but it doesn't feel right. And I have to articulate that in a appropriate manner to an adult. I think that was a very challenging piece, but that skill I think we learn is one of the most powerful tools in my toolbox that I use to this day. Being able to navigate and converse with people on the spot and explore really difficult topics and challenging things, like it's a gift. And I always commend and applaud people when they have that ability. And I think that having that experience in high school really just kind of gave us that tool. And I would say too, I quickly realized probably around my junior year that like my end goal was not to make everybody my friend. I think journalism and writing, that was my introduction into finding my voice and feeling comfortable speaking my truth and like holding my boundaries with people. Um, when I was in journalism school, or when I was in journalism class, the editor in chief at the time was a very like radically liberal, passionate kid. He was very enthusiastic about politics, very enthusiastic about like policy reform and things I'd never heard another kid talk about. But I grew up in a very politically like charged household, and like my grandparents are very political. Like we just talk politics. It's the conversation that plays around. And so I loved hearing and engaging and seeing somebody my age also really interact in this level and be so articulate and be so factual and have it ready. I was like, I want to have that tool set and that skill set when I navigate my cultural conversations and my race conversations. And that's kind of what really hooked me in, is I kind of absorbed all of this kid's like energy and his like riz for just being on it and sticking it to the man. And to this point, like it's so funny. I think a couple of years later, this guy ended up being on Tucker Carlson's show, just as like a not like as a conservative talker, but he was speaking like against whatever point Tucker Carlson was on. But I remember watching that in college, seeing this kid like, there's my inspiration for like helping me concrete my voice, like. And through a newspaper, I realized like the platform that I had and the ability to create a space for me to have an unfiltered voice. People couldn't tell me how to write. People couldn't tell me what to do. And I was very grateful. I had an advisor at the time, Stephanie, even that was so supportive of my work and the things that I wanted to write about. And the first piece I ever wrote for the newspaper was about my experience in a football game where our entire student section was singing Gold Digger by Kanye West. And in the chorus, it's, he says the N-word in it. And my whole student section just singing along, full N-word, everything. And the mortification that came over me and like the shock and horror. And then the way that it became tenfold when a Black parent came over to the stands and was like, is this a joke? Are you kidding me? And no kids were embarrassed around me, like nothing. That to me, I was like, oh, I'm in a weird community. Like, this is not right. Like, that there's not enough conversations around these things to the point where we're normalizing this behavior. This is an adult basically pleading to children to stop. Like any other place, I don't think that that would have been tolerated. That was a catalyst for me. And I was like, I think I have a mission here, like a job almost. It felt like I had a job, a need to bring race to the forefront of LO's mind, whether they wanted it to be or not, because we're here. I didn't want to continue to be subjected to these weird passive racist moments. Like it does a really weird thing to psyche that I don't think we talk about enough as Black people, trying to suppress and marginalize ourselves in these extremely white centric spaces where overt and covert oppression happens all the time. And usually because we're one of one in these spaces or one of few, we don't validate that that was wrong. We try to rationalize and normalize behaviors. We try to dehumanize the actions or like depersonalize the actions. And in reality, we're not doing anything but creating more of a problem because we're not holding people accountable and we're not saying that doesn't fly. Like when you say that word, you're being directly derogatory towards me. And I think in high school, I was really fixated on making sure people understood I'm not mad at you, but this thing bothers me. Now, in my older young adult life, I'm like, no, this thing bothers me and I'm mad at you because you intentionally did this thing. And if you don't understand your intent, then you probably should do some more considering. So, yeah, that was a lot of, I think, the situational embarrassment and like need to marginalize and make things nice really motivated me to have my own unfiltered platform where I could speak freely on these things. And that's how I started with the writing.
Oh, wow. It's one, it's just always interesting. I feel like every generation of Black students at, the LO schools kind of has their versions of different types of these just like outrageously very public facing racist stories. Like with we're playing basketball, we were playing Lincoln state tournament. One of their players is going up to the free throw line, a Black player, and crowd just starts chanting "hooked on phonics" and "you can't read," and then of course I remember the like that was the thing obviously that night, and then even when they're trying to address it as little as the school district did, even just like trying to put something in the announcements and seeing like all the pushback from students, because it's always just oh, it's just a joke. Oh, it's not serious. Like, because that's how they always try and play it off. And again, you're what's the word? You're like the one of very few there. So you're playing the side between I deal with these people every day, but also like if you can't even see what's wrong with this, what are we doing? To your point though about writing and like the platform, like again, I first got familiar with your work because a former LO teacher, actually shared one of your articles in Lakeviews with me, and then I think you were hosting like a discussion later after that, and she invited me to that. So I think it just kind of like speaks to how when you talk about finding your voice, how it can be, like writing helps you like make stuff that takes on a life of its own. So like, I had a column in the LO Review when I was in high school, and the thing that was cool about that was just getting feedback from people in the city and seeing, okay, like having these conversations. And for the most part, like I did talk a little bit about curriculum, but for the most part, it was like, Hurricane Katrina and like national issues or stuff that honestly was like more abstract. Like it wasn't, I think if I did anything like really responding to like current events in LO, but I think that's like a different step of power because as I've seen just in my time with doing like respond to racism stuff, there are a lot of people who will engage with the anti-racism conversation, but they don't want it to feel like it's tangible and happening here. Like
show them examples of their community contributing to that problem, the racist problem, they're in disbelief and almost angry at you for showing them. That was something I experienced writing for Lake Views, was my consistency and my theme of race became, I think, a sore spot in a lot of people's sides. Like, folks were tired of hearing about the racist things that were going on, but I wasn't going to stop writing on them just because you were tired of hearing about it. Imagine the 14-year-old little boy that goes home crying to his mom because his classmates are sending him little letters with like KKK on them. Like, that's, and then white people trying to explain, oh, it's just a joke. Kids will be kids. That same joke is rooted in ideology that later becomes concreted into that person's subconscious. He later becomes a citizen and a taxpayer in the same way that these people that were marginalized by that kid are. Like, that's not a joke to me. That becomes concreted into a person's ideology. You're normalizing and okaying that behavior.
Well, also, it stops being a joke when you make it literally all the time.
All the time.
And it's also not funny. But again, you make it's the joke you make all the time. So,
mm-hmm. And the fixation of this community, like, I don't know, something I noticed was like kids have such a fixation on things they obviously have no clue about. And so there's a failure in our school districts and our curriculums of not talking about race enough, and not talking about diversity in a let's pass it simplistic way, and then everybody's equal and we're all the same. Like, no, we're not. There's a reason that he gets to make these jokes, and like, it hits me in this way, and there's nothing I could say to my white peer that would ever come to this detriment. Like, clearly we're different, and let's address those differences in a way that people can understand it. Yeah. And I do want to speak to your point on the way that your column allowed you to engage and interact with the larger community. I felt that way too. When I was writing, I had a lot of response from like parents and other community members, longtime community members, that had a lot to say about different feedback. And when I was 16 and 17 and 18, I felt, wow, what a privilege it is for me to be able to like have such adult conversations with adults in my community and be a part of these changing conversations and be part of this change. And now at 24, I'm like, wow, how gross of this city to subject the children to doing the work that the community and adults in the community need to be doing. This should not be on our kids to highlight and express and show us that there's problems in our community. Like, I think because of my experience, I gained a lot of great tools, but I also gained an inability to trust people necessarily and their intentions, because I had to do a lot of deflecting and like sussing out. Like, I had to suss out intent a lot growing up, and I think that's a thing that becomes so ingrained now in me that I forget to not approach everything with my walls up or my guard up or assuming ill intent or assuming a racial bias. Like, and that sucks. Like, I don't want to walk through life assuming negative racial intent or anything like that, but because of the way that I grew up, I can't help it. I do see things through a lens of race. And because my experiences prioritized race for me, whether I wanted it to be or not.
Yeah, I think it's an important point you make about, as far as like so much of the burden of this falling on, teenagers to do so much of this work. And I will say it's kind of a double-edged sword in one hand, because like, no, like it should not be their charge to do this. Like, obviously, I will say from a weird like strategic standpoint, in terms of like the voices that anyone will actually listen to, once you get past like a certain age, you'll notice that like they start what's the word? Yeah, just like devalue, like you're already devalued at a certain point, just in the eyes of engaging with, indifferent white people. But like, I can say from, even though I was saying the same things when I was there, where it becomes a lot easier for people to tell you, oh, that didn't happen. You're making that up. And other people around them to be like, yeah, yeah, whatever. So it's like this weird, I don't know, it's that weird struggle that all these movements have had over the years when it comes to like engaging with youth and trying to like find that balance between giving voice to youth while also not like throwing them out there as cannon fodder, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's it's heavy, but
And I'm grateful, I should say. I loved having the platform and the ability to express and have my voice heard by the community. I loved the fact that I had channels and avenues that allowed me to put on forums and create the student union and continue to highlight different race problems in our community. I think the piece that I struggled with, and I didn't struggle with it until after the fact, was the educational, like the training, the teaching aspect of it. I wasn't on LOSD's salary, but somehow I helped facilitate racial equity trainings and like brought in speakers to talk about like race in Oregon, like those kinds of things. I was so passionate as a kid that I wanted to do, excuse me, as a teenager, that I wanted to do these things. Uh, but that wasn't like, that shouldn't have been, there's needed to have been an adult to say, I love this energy. How can we take this and help create this in a more structured way, in a way that is long term? So it's not just a one off from an excited kid in the class of 2017 that got to put on a couple events. It's no recurring. You have the civil rights attorney of Oregon coming to do these presentations every year for these economic classes. Like that's what needed to happen. And I think that's where us as a community, we're losing the momentum, is we want to highlight these teenagers and highlight the voices that are the front lines, because teenagers are often the front lines of this experience. But we're not taking the tangibles from what they're saying and moving on them. That's the piece that I'm really struggling with, is that like, Bruce, I feel like we have had this conversation for years. Like we've been talking about these things for years, and it's great. I want to keep the conversation alive, but how do we move the needle where we're actually making this tangible change?
yeah, I hear that, and it's, again, I want to sound like as I feel like I'm taking the establishment voice here, but because it's difficult on one hand because a lot of this stuff always moves slower than we actually want it to. But also, again, to your point, as far as like not just, and I know these are not the words you're saying, but as far as like not making it, just this like dog and pony show type thing where we have the same conversation over and over again. And more importantly, we don't provide the supports like around some of this stuff. Because, for example, when you talk about like doing professional work, but not getting treated as if you're a professional, and having people in fact expect you to provide that for free with no concern about not just like the labor itself, but so like just like the psychological stuff, like you said, like the trust issues that arise from trying to do that. Like that is an issue. That's not something we can just and keep going around in circles with. But also, I think with, especially with like the youth part, and this is another reason why I want to kind of like talk about the BSU story. I feel like when it become like, I do think there are very just very like important things that kind of like come from when you do have some of these opportunities. And I don't say that again as like, oh, it's an opportunity for like exposure and stuff like this, but as far as like things to like develop like professional skills in sort of like a setting where they're actual like you're actually trying to do something. I think that does like translate and can help, just not just as far as like racial justice, but in general. But
Yeah.
also it shouldn't be like the only, like especially with anti-racism in a space like LO, it becomes like people basically put that on you as your identity. And that's a
Yes.
whole other very toxic, draining, exhausting thing. And again,
That's a
if we don't
great way
have
to
like the
put it.
supports for it, then, you know, like you said, you can be that enthusiastic kid, but once you burn out or once you like just have like a different experience where that's not where you're immersed in, yeah, you're gonna look back and be like, but like this isn't it. How do we do? We gotta do better. So, you know, I say that's kind of like a clunky transition into talking about the BSU, but I do think again, like creating spaces where you actually have community
Yep.
within the school where you don't have to, just spend all day alone, just trying to navigate is important, and kind of like creating that institution, not just for yourself, but for future students. Like it's like you can't really like downplay the importance of that work. But can you just talk about yeah, can you just talk a little bit about like how did the BSU at Lake Oswego High School come together? And like what year was this?
Yeah, that was my junior year. So I'd been on the newspaper like all of my junior year by that time. I really think I formed BSU out of a need to create that space, like that safe space for not only myself, but in thinking about I've got a younger sister that's about 4 years behind me, and just imagining her navigating social circles the same way that I did, not having that space where she could engage with her Black peers or engage with just non-white peers, and talk through some of those challenges of like being the only Black kid in the class, or what do you do when you're in a car full of your white friends and they all want to say the N-word. Like we needed those conversations in those spaces as a kid, and a safe space to do that. And so that was a big push for me to start the BSU. I also felt like uh, at the time there was a Latino student union, and I think there was a Gay Straight Alliance, and like a Jewish student union, and it felt weird to me that as traditional, culturally traditional, our community is, that we didn't have another one, or we didn't have any sort of multicultural anything. Uh, so I wanted to get that started. I just felt like it was necessary, like rooted in tradition, like it's part of our culture, right? Like we had this here. So it took some promotion. I think I had to like market the club to get an advisor to like sign off on it. But I did have a vice principal at the time, was amazing, and he was super into the idea of creating a Black student union, so he helped advise it. Unfortunately, when he left, that was the challenge the next year, was like finding another advisor to take it over. My political action seminar teacher agreed to help advise, and honestly, there wasn't like any structural things that I got from them. Like it was just so that we could be in the yearbook per se. Majority of the meetings we had at my house, just because we had one meeting at the school and everyone was like, this is not a safe space to talk. So I was like, okay, we're going to move the meetings to my house and my mom will make dinner. So we started doing meetings at my house, dinner. And I think initially my goal was to like be more of like a committee or a council. Like I wanted to enact change, but what the BSU morphed into really was therapy space for us to get together and have a meal together and talk through the challenges and the difficulties, of navigating high school as a Black kid in predominantly white spaces. And the camaraderie I found through that was just amazing. Like I really made some really good connections from that group that are lifelong to me. And I think having the knowing that other teenagers were experiencing really similar things as me allowed me to feel a little bit safer in my spaces. and allowed me to breathe a little bit and sleep a little bit more at night. I think I was really, really struggling with feeling isolated like my junior and senior year. And I think that that is just a normal feeling of being a teenager, going through like emotions and friendships, relationships. Teenager, it's like a very hormonally changing time, right? And so you're feeling these really big things all the time, not knowing how to process them. So having that space really, it created that sense of safety for me. And I saw the way that it created a sense of safety for others in the group too. And I just wanted to continue to foster that space and create safety. I think that's kind of what created my hyperfixation around the need to create safe spaces for people. And I've always been very like politically engaged, as I kind of mentioned before. I grew up in a very like politically conscious household, and growing up listening to my elders speak on politics all the time. I was interested in like how can I create that channel for the Black Student Union to feel engaged and feel like they have capacity. Because something I noticed too was a lot of the members in my group didn't feel like they had the agency. They all thought of like, oh, because Camryn writes on the newspaper, like she can do it, she can do it. And it was like, no, all of us can do this. Let me show you how. Like, you just have to feel safe and comfortable to like demand the things that you need or ask for the things that you want. And I think I tested that water when I was able to set up, and it was through one of the dads in the group that helped me with this. He did some community like development stuff, somehow knew some folks that worked for the state, and he was able to help us get signed up to go down to Salem, to the Capitol during lobby day. And so we got to, during school, take a bus down, go to Salem with our Black Student Union, and we got to meet, at the time, she was the House Speaker, Tina Kotek, and we got to sit down with Tina Kotek and talk about race in schools and talk about the experiences of Black kids in predominantly white schools, and how to make it more equitable. And that space, just being able to speak to like a real person, like a legit official, like everybody was like, oh my gosh, we really can do that. Like we can do these things. And I think that experience to me was one of those concrete, like, yeah, you got to keep going. You need to keep creating the spaces and keep facilitating safety, because once you show people the safe spaces, like people thrive. People thrive in safety, and that's what people need. So yeah, sorry, I'm getting a little long-winded thinking about like BSU. Taking me down memory lane a little bit. I haven't thought about this stuff in a while. I do think that that is kind of what kickstarted my like career as well. So I work in housing now, and in affordable housing and resident services. Specifically, I help in Eugene manage and develop permanent supportive housing. So it's housing that's focused on extremely critically homeless communities. And so we're targeting getting the most vulnerable people off of the streets. That's another version for me of creating safety. How do I help people interact and engage with institutions and structures and systems that have burned them so many times before, and to feel safe enough in these interactions and in these spaces to demand and ask the things that they need so that they can thrive? Because everybody, like I said, deserves to thrive. And I think, yeah, having those opportunities and those moments in high school through the BSU just fixated my brain and allowed me to realize like what my career goals are, and what I want to get out of my life.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Eugene, and you also I'm a former Duck. You went to U of O, as Go Ducks. And definitely, it's not like Eugene is exactly a hotbed of diversity in itself, or even like the U of O as a college campus is not exactly like super diverse. But I did notice, is different coming from LO. So I was curious if you could just like compare kind of like your time at U of O to, well, I guess not compare, just like, did you feel like you were able to find like more community, anything?
It's interesting that you say that, because you're right. I would say that the makeup, the demographics of University of Oregon is basically Lake O 2.0. Like it's very predominantly white. You definitely see people of color, but in similar patterns. Like I noticed a lot of the folks that I engaged, like saw in classes. So went to school for political science and then public policy planning and management. I did not have a lot of other Black people in my political science classes, especially. Like those spaces were dominated by like white men for the most part. It wasn't until I like did my design school, the 3 p.m. side, that I started to notice like non-white people in spaces and like more women and non-binary people and just like it was a break. And so I had to think about like some of the spaces that I'm in, like how does that contribute to isolating myself? It's not a me problem per se, but just like, structurally and socially. Also, Eugene is very like bubbled, so the populations and pockets of diversity are like all in spaces and chunks. Like it's very segregated in a weird way. And you have to seek it out to like find the diversity, but it's there to your point. I don't think I was as intentional my first 2 years of going to school down there as I was like in my later years of trying to seek out that diversity, because I realized like what a safe feeling and like the feeling of home and community it creates when you're around people that look like you and you don't have to explain things as much. It was a lot better, and I do appreciate the way that Eugene. I don't know. Maybe ask me that one in 5 years. I'm still processing through that one. Like I still live in Eugene too, so it's definitely different. I think there's another cultural element to Eugene that's different than Lake Oswego. Like Lake Oswego is like predominantly middle upper class. Eugene is like fairly college town suburban, and then you get the rural. Like the actual culture of Eugene is like fairly rural and more like conservative, and that's a completely different type of interaction. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. Like class plays a lot into how people interact. And I would say in Lake Oswego, you probably were more likely to experience like subliminal racism or like unconscious bias. Whereas in Eugene, Springfield, like you're more likely to be able to visibly see somebody's like discomfort at your race or your being in general. And for me personally, I find it a little bit easier to navigate in those spaces because I can easily see a Confederate flag and be like, that's not a space for me. Whereas like here, you have an all like Black Lives Matter sign in your yard, but then your kids say the N-word. So that's really confusing to me. Like living in these different cultural pockets has made me realize like I actually prefer where it's a little bit easier to identify and see that people are less willing to understand or engage versus being in spaces where everyone is performatively allied, but it's not fundamentally applied to their everyday life.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, Camryn, thank you again for taking the time today. Before I let you go though, one of the things we want to do with this project is get, just like what advice now you have, again, like you've talked a little bit about just like looking back on the LO experience and kind of like just some of the things, you've really had to like work and wrestle with. But do you have like any advice for current students in your position, just in terms of not necessarily like, how to like advocate, but like just deal, honestly?
First and foremost, breathe. I wish I would have listened to that one a little bit harder, but it was hard because I didn't have a lot of trust in others. Just breathe and trust that people see you, we see you, we hear you. You're not crazy. You're not invalid for the things that you're feeling based on the experiences that you're going through. Stay focused, do the things that you want to highlight, but the moment you feel like you're doing more work than the adults around you, take a moment to pause and ask questions. I think I wish I would have done that a little bit more and asked more of the adults around, more from the adults around me, instead of taking it as a personal mission to do the savior work. I think the motivation and energy of a teenager, you want to be savior, you want to do it, you want to fix it. But the reality is that the adults around us have the capacity to help and structurally change too. And so lean on your adults and lean on these spaces to help push and promote. I'm very grateful that we're continuing to create these spaces with young adults so that they can feel a little bit safer. Yeah, the biggest thing is breathe and trust your gut, trust your instinct. You're not wrong. You're feeling like something is off. I think I spent a lot of time second guessing myself when I didn't need to. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, Camryn, thank you again for taking the time and sharing a lot of very, again, just important insights. And I hope anyone watching this, whether they be students, whether they be the adults, as you've mentioned, who have the power, the positions, the leverage, the resources to really, make these structural changes. Yeah, I hope people are listening. So yeah, thank you again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.